Thanks for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast, and we are progressing with our HR for High Performance series, and I guess quite a lot of the HR links into OD, which of course is my background. We're on to episode 7, learning for high performance, so how that fits into a high performance culture. And again, the purpose of this series is that many of us are generalists, but many of us are also specialists. And so we don't necessarily know everything that we need to know in a certain area. And in HR, sometimes learning and development sits in that different space. So what we want to do here is give some practical takeaways if you are somebody who's in that space and wants to know more about how you can create a culture of learning. Maybe you didn't come through a learning and development background. What are the top tips there? So how can we use this culture of learning that enhances skills, drives innovation, and really ensures continuous development? Why do you want to do that? Well, you want to do it because it is a driver of high performance. You know, having opportunities to learn and grow is one of those key questions when you look at employee engagement. Many of us work in organisations where we don't have the opportunity to reward performance through pay, and therefore having learning opportunities for people to learn and grow is a motivator. And of course, how are we going to improve performance in this very fast-moving environment that we all live and work in if people are not able to learn? And it can't be old-fashioned spoon feeding. It's got to be a way in which it's totally cultural. It's embedded. We need people to be able to continuously learn, not just for individual growth, but also for organisational success. But of course, people don't always feel that they've got permission all the time to learn. And if they don't feel that, it's just not going to happen. And again, that's why it is cultural. So in this episode, we're going to explore what a learning culture actually means, why it matters so much for performance, and how you can build one that's, sticky, that it's the way you do things. I'm going to draw on thinking, because I've not been in the learning space personally in an organisation for a while. So I'm drawing on some thinking from some industry experts, of course, the CIPD, the BPS, British Psychological Society, examples from my own work, and also people like Michelle Parry-Slater and David James, whose work I really, really respect in this space. And if you don't know them, go and look them up and follow them on LinkedIn. So first of all, what do we mean by a learning culture? Well, let's start with the basics. The CIPD would define a learning culture as one in which learning is embedded in every aspect of organisational life. So it's not just about offering training courses, the old-fashioned sheep dip training that you do training to people. And it's not about compliance-driven training, which is what I see in many organisations that we work in, where it's almost a stick as opposed to a carrot approach, people wanting to see where they want to go. They're doing it because they have to. So that is almost the opposite of a learning culture there. One of the ways of thinking about learning culture, I drew on the work that Michelle Parry-Slater that I mentioned earlier talks about. She talks about EPC, so environment, permission and culture. She's saying you need to create the right environment for people to learn in. So an environment would be where they want to learn, they see the need to learn, they have the opportunity to learn, they're being encouraged to learn, they've got the time to learn. And you also have to give people the permission to learn. So that might be the permission to take time out and try things differently. It might be leading by example. It might be recognising that people are trying things differently. And through that then embeds this culture where learning is valued at every level. I mean, the opposite of that, I remember when we used to run training courses in the organisation I'd work in, and people would be pulled off them by a line manager. There'd be always something that's seen as important in place of it. I mean, you think about this, you've heard me talk about people and performance management, where one-to-ones, if they're shifted at the last minute, where managers are not seen to value them, then it sends a really strong message. And the same is the case for learning. Now, that's not saying that if you've got an important customer crisis, that you don't postpone learning to another time, but it should still be seen as something that's important. It may not be urgent, but it needs to be seen as important, and it needs to be valued. And the other element of this in terms of culture is this concept of psychological safety. Again, I'm sure this is a term that many of you have heard of it. It's coined by Harvard professor Amy Edmondson. She describes it as a shared belief that it is safe to take interpersonal risks. And that's a really interesting thing, is saying that learning, basically admitting that you don't know everything, comes with a level of risk. So we need to create this environment where it's okay for people to speak up, to ask questions, to admit mistakes, or admit they don't know the answer without the fear of embarrassment or punishment. And that is a bit different, I think, from some environments that people work in. If you want to put this into place, because I think it's an abstract theory for many of us, one of the tools that I've used on this is looking at it in 4 stages of psychological safety. So you could recognise where your team is or your organisation in terms of this. So in terms of psychological safety, we might see ourselves as, first of all, having inclusion safety and having that sense of belonging, feeling part of the team. If someone doesn't feel part of the team, they're not going to admit they don't know things. So you must start by people feeling included. Then it's about this sense that it's okay to learn and grow, to not know the answers. So we call that learner safety. That's our second stage. Third and fourth stages are getting a little bit more out there. So contributor safety, this is where somebody might speak up in a meeting. They don't mind putting their opinion in. They feel that their opinion might be valued and they can contribute to a discussion. So they have the confidence in themselves, and that is only going to have built if they felt accepted and safe to ask questions in the first place. Or even where, if you think about it, where you might ask for somebody's opinion. So say, what do you think? What's your thoughts? So we show that we value their contribution is how you're going to get people to feel safe to do that. And then finally, the highest level is where you've got people who actually feel safe to challenge. And that can be so important when you look at organisations where they talk about things like whistleblowing, where risks take place, endemic negative cultures, is where people don't feel safe to challenge something in a constructive way. And that's the highest level here. The BPS, the British Psychological Society, they emphasise that learning can really only thrive in that kind of environment where people feel trusted and respected. So think about that. Where is your organisation in relation to that? How can you build it? And you're not going to go straight to Challenger. Well, I mean, you may have some really confident people who go straight in at Challenger, and that might be misplaced confidence, in fairness. But how can you build that level by including people, making it okay to ask questions, ask their opinion, encourage contribution, and really help people feel that, we're learning together. It's a good day to learn something. Of course, when we think about this, why do we want to do this? Well, I've touched on it in terms of employee engagement, but the CIPD absolutely demonstrates, and the research demonstrates, that it's a driver of high performance. Organisations that have strong learning cultures see better productivity, retention, and employee engagement. Not only that, when people are learning, they're more innovative, they're more confident, and they're more likely to collaborate. And David James, who speaks great on this topic, he's got lots to say. He argues that learning and development shouldn't be measured by how many courses we run. And this is, of course, the difficulty, isn't it, when we're looking for things like KPIs and metrics, tangible things. So it shouldn't be the numbers of courses we put on, or how many people attend, or the numbers of learning hours. So if you think about things like CPD, which is how things tend to be tracked, but actually we need to ask about outcomes. Is this learning helping people perform better? So really we want to have this connection with performance. And certainly that is one of the holy grails of L&D. Speaking as somebody who spent many years in an internal role in L&D, sometimes you measured learning and development through what we call happy sheets. You've talk about the Kirkman model of evaluation, things like this. But actually, are we really measuring effectiveness of learning? Because ultimately, it's only really valuable when it goes through and we see outcomes, business outcomes, performance outcomes. Now, the sort of things that you might see there, I think it's quite tricky in its own right, but you could see employee engagement as something there. You could see levels of innovation as something that would fit with an organisational outcome. What would be an organisational outcome related to learning in your organisation? It could be that people don't take as many risks, or sorry, don't make as many mistakes. Actually, maybe do take risks, but don't make the same mistakes. Organisations that I've worked in before, we used to be really poor at pausing. We were very busy, and rarely took time to think about what were the lessons learned from a project. And those part of the lessons learned is about working out actually what went wrong and finding out how you can avoid it in future. So having awareness, and that means that it's not always about everything that's gone brilliantly, although there's definitely a place for appreciative inquiry and looking at positives and helping people know what they do right in things. I think of when I've worked with high-performing salespeople, one of their challenges is they don't always know what their skills are. So there's something about individual performance, helping people to be self-aware, and that could be through evaluation, it could be through 360 feedback, and people recognising what their secret sauce is. Then they can repeat it. But sometimes it's not as obvious as that, or it's a case of, we may do lots of things really well. What couple of tweaks could we do that would make us even better? So thinking about feedback, having those cultures of employee feedback, self-awareness, that's going to help individual performance. But linking to it overall, looking back to strategically, you can look at learning in your organisation at 3 levels. You can look at it from an organisational level, so supporting strategic business outcomes. You can look at it at a team level, and you can look at it as individual level. So I've just touched on things to do with individual level, helping people grow personally, develop their skills, employee engagement, develop their careers, giving them better self-awareness. So tools around feedback, things like competency metrics, individual personal development plans, all of those things are really powerful at the individual level. Although you do need the EPC, so the environment, the permission and the culture for people to actually develop within those. A great example of that for me would be something like doing 360-degree feedback, where somebody might get some useful evaluation, but depending on the culture of the organisation, depends on whether or not the feedback they've been provided with is high quality, and sometimes they'll get no comments at all. So they may get marked up or down on a specific behaviour, but there's no comments to give examples as to why someone's rated that way. That's an example of a culture that isn't all that mature or positive, whereas others may get really helpful, constructive examples of what they could do even better, and that's really helpful for people and makes something like a 360 a really good growth opportunity. The same example there, if you want to use a tool like that, is making sure that you have a coach or somebody to go through the evaluation with the individual so that they take lots of positives. Again, what I'm saying here is making sure people know what they do well is as important, because you want them to repeat those behaviours, as it is knowing what they could do less of or what they can improve on. So in individual level, those are things that we can absolutely develop. It is cultural, and it's embedding things like that effectively and using them constructively. Team level is how well do people learn, share information, driving collaboration across functions. So you could do things where you're trying to break down barriers, encouraging people to have lunch and learns, lessons learned I was talking about with the projects there, encouraging just topics on, if you might have groups in terms of use SharePoint or Teams or something like that, where people share information, and that collaboration is helping teams work together effectively. Not just that might be technical information, giving people awareness of their team style. So you could use tools like Belbin or Myers-Briggs to think about what people's different personalities and communication styles are and help them work more effectively as a team. And then at an organisational level, it's making sure that whatever you're investing in, it has a strategic benefit. It's coordinated, it's linked to where the organisation's going. So you're not just investing in people going on MBAs for the sake of it, who are then going to leave. You're working on maybe business projects, and that is a great way, actually, something like a business project, because something where an individual can develop their own skills working on something they've not worked on before. They might be working in a new team, which is also going to be beneficial. And if they're working together to implement a new system or come up with a problem solving a problem to a specific instance, that can in turn work on all three levels. So being really canny, if you like, if you're in a learning and development position, thinking about how can we create learning opportunities, so on the job learning opportunities, that's going to benefit everybody at all three levels. And that's the key thing, to be creative. Now, that's not formal training. I mean, some of those things, a bit of coaching, a bit of educating, a bit of sharing information, a bit of personal analysis. But equally, it could be just working on a project together with a really clear outcome and learning from what worked or didn't work, being set up for success, because you can give project teams the right skills, making sure you've got good project leaders. But those are the sort of things that can be really powerful in terms of helping people to learn. And I think if any of you have ever been on these sort of outdoor bounds things, you think, oh, do you learn from not? Well, actually, it is that experiential learning can be really powerful for people, as long as you're given that time to reflect. But of course, it's not easy. So you're going to come across barriers, and I suppose there's a few that I'm sort of hinting at there. Time is a big barrier. Now, people often think that, well, they don't recognise it. They might be actually doing lots of learning. It's just not recognised. So, if a line manager doesn't do any coaching, then, or let's flip it positively, if the line manager takes time to say, okay, so what have you learned this week? What did you do? Or what have we learned? Let's share some learnings. If you have something cultural like that, people will realise, actually, I'm learning all the time. I've just learned something new. I've learned a new skill. But often it's just not being recognised. Learning really doesn't always look like a classroom. In fact, it hardly ever looks like a classroom. Lots of learning comes from talking to other people, mentoring, and as I said earlier, making a mistake in a safe environment and being able to learn from it, as opposed to humiliated and embarrassed. And that's why we need to have that permission to learn. And we need our leaders to role model it. And we need to make sure that we're not just going for sticking plaster training. Again, that's a Michelle Parry-Slater thing. She talked about no plasters. She did this a few years ago. And that's why we're talking about sort of a one-off tick box, job done, solve that problem. I mean, I've had people sent to me to be fixed. That's a sticking plaster. That is not going to work. You need to have something much more organic. And, if we're not trying to make it highly relevant to a real business problem, we're probably not actually we're probably wasting time and investment. So we need to make sure that we're really practical in terms of embedding our learning culture. And these are 5 practical steps that you can think about. So first of all, I'd look at the leadership in your organisation and get them to lead by example. Can you get them to say, what are they learning? What are they struggling on? What book am I reading? What challenges have they had? Signals that learning and actually not always knowing the right answers is normal and it's valued. Make time for learning. Make that part of your culture, that it's valued. And that means not just sort of saying you've got to do your compliance training by XYZ date. It's making it part of the job, not something extra. Maybe dedicated time, certain days or times in the week. Having short, regular learning sessions that are embedded into the workflow, just encouraging and reinforcing people who do take that time to do it. Social learning. Now, we haven't really touched on that yet. Now, that's probably one of the fastest growing areas. If you think about, you're often learning stuff. The only challenge can be that some of the stuff we see on things like social media, it's not always real stuff. So you want to have valid social connections here. But if you think about things like networking or peer groups, I've got various WhatsApp groups which have people at professional contacts that are so valuable, where you've got that trust and that relevance and credibility. There's a social learning model called the 5 C's. Connection, conversation, curation, community, and collaboration. So this is where it's got to be really sincere. People learn best from each other if they truly connect. So spaces for connection, the time to have a conversation, being curious. I'd add a 6th one, curiosity. But also things like having that sense of being part of a community that you're collaborating with, and curated content is really useful for social learning. making that opportunity for people to learn within an organisation peer-to-peer, and actually encouraging them to go and learn from colleagues in other roles. When I was in-house in an HR role, it really wasn't encouraged to go external. It makes you quite insular, and actually going external is so powerful. Make that time to network and go to those conferences. The fourth point is make sure you align with strategy. And I think I've talked about that very much. If you look at where your strategic challenges are for the business, make sure that the L&D is aligned to that. Now, why would I say that? It's to do with purpose. So people see the reason for it. It's also to do with the fact you're more likely to get investment if you need to, if it actually is taking the business in the right way. And also, arguably, what's the point if we're teaching people stuff that doesn't go with business strategy? So it really does need to align, which means that in an L&D role, we need to understand where the business strategy is going and what that means for us in learning and development. We need to be able to translate it into the skills development that are going to be relevant for our organisation. So aligning with strategy, and then finally recognising and rewarding people who are taking the time. They are doing that learning, then they're focusing on developing themselves. And all of those, if you use Actus, our software that we've talked about, and I talked about the rethinking performance management, this is why for me, if you wanted to rethink your performance management process, it's why I think that we should be talking about learning early on in the performance management year, not leaving it till the end where it's kind of an afterthought. So if at the start of the year you set objectives, business objectives, that presumably align or have been cascaded from the overall business goals, then it makes sense to talk about development a couple of months later. Find out, has that person got any development needs that might stop them from achieving their individual goals? Because if they have those gaps and they're not going to achieve their individual goals, they're not going to achieve their organisational goals either. So that's at the time where I think strategically focusing on learning there, that's going to help people be performers and recognise and reward the managers that support this and the individuals that take the time to do it. So really key there. So those 5 points that I'm talking about: embedding the culture, get leaders to lead by example, to model it, so their own learning. That also means respecting the time that others spent learning. Make learning part of the job, not something extra. So carve out time. Encourage people to set aside specific time. You could even brand it, learning lunch times, whatever it might be. Encourage social learning, learning from peers, learning from others, either inside or outside the organisation. Make sure whatever learning you're doing is aligned with individual goals and overall strategic goals, so we can see the why, and recognise and reward those behaviours for doing that. Acknowledge when people make the time to do it, and recognise it. Other practical things you can come up with: get people to reflect after key tasks. So this is about getting your managers to, or it could be a project leader to, or individuals even, so anyone, but this is how you could formalise it, by training your line managers during one-to-one. Say, okay, you've just finished a project. What worked well? What could be done differently? Classic coaching questions. Make sure that one-to-ones are doing that. So it's not just about keeping on track with something. Go, okay, what was the learning from that? Exploring learning moments, helping people to think about it, and maybe during meetings getting people to share something. What did they learn last week? Just at the start of each meeting, just creates that culture, that indicator that you're really taking it seriously. So we've covered quite a bit of content here in terms of this. Just giving a little bit of recap before we go forwards. We talked about what a learning culture is, how it might be defined. We've talked about this idea of EPC, environment, permission and culture, which is a really simple way about thinking. If you don't have those things right, it's going to be quite hard to create that learning culture. Underpinning that is psychological safety, which is making sure people feel included, they feel safe to ask questions, they are safe to speak up and contribute, and even at the highest level feel able to challenge. We know that it's really important because it drives organisational performance and employee engagement. So it's something that's definitely worth considering, it that there is a business case for learning. It's not just a nice to have. And if you look at it strategically, that's going to help justify investment in learning, and thinking about it from organisational strategic level, at team level, how you get collaboration and performance cross functions, and of course individual level. We've talked about overcoming barriers. It is about permission. It's about people recognising that they're learning even when they don't realise it. So that is really about reflection or coaching people to acknowledge that. And then our practical steps are about leading by example, making time, encouraging social learning, aligning with strategy, and then recognising and rewarding learning. The bottom line is, a high-performing learning culture doesn't come from one-off training sticking plasters, and it doesn't come from ticking boxes. If anything, those are the sort of things that can work against a learning culture. It comes from creating a safe environment where people feel included, heard, and encouraged to grow, embedding learning into everyday work, not as an extra, but as a core expectation. And I don't see how anyone can not need to do that in this day and age. You know, people go, oh, I don't want to learn things. Everyone still needs to learn wherever they are, even if they're close to retirement. It's about aligning development with real organisational goals so people see the impact or the purpose of that. And it's about rewarding and recognising learning, however small it is. And it's being safe in terms of people making errors or seeing them as opportunities to learn is something where something's gone wrong. Those changes aren't massive. We can start really small, maybe even just allowing 20, 30 minutes of protected learning time a week, or asking people at a team meeting, what did you learn last week? It all adds up and it all sends a message. And these things, with anything cultural, it doesn't happen overnight. It's about lots and lots of repeated little steps in the right direction. And that's really positive. So my practical challenge is to reflect on your organisation and think, what part of this could I change, or what do I want to work on? How are we in terms of, is it psychological safety or leading by example? Just find one maybe barrier to learning in your organisation and break it down. Focus on breaking it down. And once you've done that one, try the next. And that's how cultures change, just one little step at a time. So that concludes our 7th episode of Learning High Performance as part of our High Performance HR series. I hope you're finding them informative. I put links to other content, so I've done webinars on this topic. There will be links in the show notes if you want follow-up content in a different format. So please feel free to search that. And if you're finding this useful, please feel free to share it, subscribe, or leave a review. Thank you for joining. I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.
This episode was brought to you by Disruptive Media, helping bold entrepreneurs stand out through podcasting, video, and social content. Visit disruptivemedia.co.uk to learn more.